So today we're going to be diving into one of the most controversial issues in all of Pride and Prejudice. Charlotte Lucas marrying Mr. Collins. Did she make the right choice? The wrong choice? What is happening with Charlotte Lucas? Well, that is what we're going to be going in here today. Why Charlotte Lucas marries Mr. Collins, why this is so important to the plot of Pride and Prejudice, and what this has to do with Jane Austen's analysis of human nature, love, romance, and everything else pretty much. Well, if you want to learn more about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice, most of you guys are probably familiar with her. She's Elizabeth Bennet's friend who marries the dreaded Mr. Collins. Now, I feel like it's always been debated of whether she made a good choice, a bad choice, and what her motivations for the choice she makes are. But today what I really want to get into is the role Charlotte Lucas serves in the book, because she's actually incredibly vital to the story and also the issues Jane Austen is trying to explore. So first off, we need to start with Charlotte Lucas's most basic function in the story, which is to be a foil of Elizabeth Bennet. So if you see my video, What is Mary Bennet's Purpose in Life, then you know what a literary foil is, or where there's one character who's similar to another character, but also different enough that they really highlight the different characteristics of each. For example, in Sense and Sensibility, we have Marianne and Eleanor. They're sisters, they're young women, they're similar, but their personalities and temperaments are so different that they really highlight the differences in each. And Jane Austen's able to explore different issues and approaches to life through their characters this way. Likewise, that's the purpose that Charlotte Lucas serves for Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Charlotte are very similar in that they're young women in the same neighborhood, they're in the same social circle, they're both single, both don't have a lot of money, and they need to find a husband. Now, if they don't find a husband, they're both going to end up poor old maids, dependent on the charity of their relatives. But those are the similarities that make Elizabeth and Charlotte really similar enough for us to compare them. Now, what are some of their differences? Well, of course, we know Elizabeth is younger, she is prettier, she is of a slightly higher social standing, and so she has all of those factors going for her to be able to find a husband. Meanwhile, obviously, Charlotte is older. She's 27, just ancient, guys. And her family is very new to the landed gentry. Her father just barely bought their house at Lucas Lodge. He was formerly in trade, and so she is from a family that is kind of trying to social climb a little bit, which is something I've talked about in my video on how to marry up. So now it comes down to Charlotte and Elizabeth, and they're both single young women. They both need to make a match. They both need to marry someone who can ideally keep them at their genteel lifestyle they are used to. However, they need to make sure that they love said guy. So it's the money plus love combination they're looking for. Or is it? And I feel like this is where the actual difference between Elizabeth and Charlotte that Jane Austen was really focusing on comes into view, because what Elizabeth and Charlotte differ on the most is their approach to marriage and love. The flashpoint of this becoming the key issue between them is Mr. Collins's proposals. Of course, he proposes to Lizzy and she turns him down, and he proposes to Charlotte and she accepts him. This is the biggest difference between them in the book, and it all boils down to how they view human nature, romance, and the true source of happiness in life. So let's actually dive into all of those issues. So first up, let's talk about the issue of, is love even real? In Pride and Prejudice, we have Charlotte Lucas saying things like, I'm not a romantic, I never was. We have Jane Austen noting that she does not think highly of either matrimony or men. Basically, Charlotte Lucas is not romantic. And thankfully, Jane Austen does not leave us wondering why she's not romantic. To find the answer, let's look at this quote from Pride and Prejudice. This is when Charlotte and Elizabeth are discussing Jane and Bingley's relationship, and Charlotte says, "I wish Jane success with all my heart, and if she were married to him tomorrow, I should think she had a good chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12-month. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other, or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation, and it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life." So this is a very famous Charlotte Lucas quote, but I feel like often what's overlooked is what she's actually saying here. She says happiness in marriage is a matter of chance. But why is it a matter of chance? Well, because she says this about human nature, that dispositions of the parties ever so well known does not advance their felicity in the least because they'll grow sufficiently unlike afterwards. Okay. So let's go back to my video on does Elizabeth really love Mr. Darcy? That's where we talk about the concept of romance in the Regency era and what they were looking for ideally in a mate. And remember, a lot of the things they were looking for was compatibility of disposition, esteeming other people's characters, and of course, love and romantic affection based off of that. But here we see Charlotte hitting at the very basis of this idea. She says, no, you cannot truly know someone's disposition beforehand, and they're going to change after you marry them. Basically, the foundation upon which Elizabeth Bennet is going to rest her future happiness of romance isn't real. It can't be known, and it will change later. Now, what's so fascinating about this is the way that Charlotte Lucas is approaching learning about human nature. Now, like in my video on how not to marry Mr. Wickham, we talk about how a main theme throughout Jane Austen's books is how hard it is to know ourselves and to know other people and to be able to see reality clearly. So Jane Austen knows that knowing other people is difficult. But what's coming down to the main difference here is throughout Jane Austen's novels, coming to self-knowledge and the knowledge of others is difficult, but she portrays it as possible and a worthy struggle that we need to aim towards. While Charlotte presents it as something that is impossible, she's very pessimistic about it. And I think this is one of the main differences we see here between the way Elizabeth tries to come to self-knowledge and knowledge of other people like Darcy and Wickham, and the way that Charlotte's like, it's hopeless. You can't know other people. That's not how life works. Really, I think something that highlights this characteristic in Charlotte is the fact that she's not the only Jane Austen character to have this viewpoint. And I think Charlotte has a twin when it comes to how she views marriage and how she views money, and in a very unexpected source, Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park. Now we can really see Mary Crawford's viewpoint on this highlighted from this quote from Mansfield Park. So when discussing love and romance with her sister, Mary Crawford says that everybody is taken in at some period or other. And when her sister says, not always in marriage, dear Mary, she says, in marriage especially. There is not 1 in 100 of either sex who is not taken in when they marry. Look where I will, I see that it is so, and I feel that it must be so, when we consider that it is, of all transactions, the one in which people expect most from others and are least honest themselves. Speaking from my own observation, it is a maneuvering business. I know so many who have married in the full expectation and confidence of some one particular advantage in the connection, or accomplishment, or good quality in the person, who have found themselves entirely deceived and have been obliged to put up with exactly the reverse. What is this but a take-in? So here we see Mary Crawford saying something very interesting, that people are actively deceiving each other because they want the most out of marriage and they're the least honest themselves. Basically, when trying to go into the marital state, you can't be sure of others' true nature. Now, what's so fascinating, I think, about this similarity between Charlotte and Mary is the fact that they're so different in their circumstances. Of course, Charlotte is a poor old maid and Mary is a wealthy young lady who's getting a lot of male attention. Basically, it's not those circumstances that are making them have this view of marriage. It's their underlying distrust of being able to come to an accurate knowledge of other people's characters. Because like we see in Mary's quote, you can go into marriage with these expectations, but then you can find them all dashed. There's a lack of security happening. And when there's that lack of security, they feel like they can't base their future happiness off of what other people would say is romance, right? They're like, I don't trust this idea that people like Elizabeth Bennet, Fanny Price believe in, because you can't truly know someone. And because they can't trust the idea, it leads them to look for happiness somewhere else. And I think this takes us to the second key issue with Charlotte Lucas, which is, what is the source of true happiness in marriage? And the answer for Charlotte and for Mary comes down to money. So in Pride and Prejudice, after Charlotte accepts Collins and Elizabeth finds out about it, Elizabeth has something very interesting to think on this topic. It says she had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she had not supposed it to be possible that when called into action, she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. So here we see Elizabeth setting up better feeling versus worldly advantage. So, of course, better feeling would be wanting to have that marriage of true affection. This is something that a lot of Jane Austen heroines aspire towards. Elizabeth certainly does, Jane Bennet does, Fanny Price does, and in Persuasion does. Basically, they want their marriage to be based on love, and they really connect that idea to happiness. In fact, if we look at the way Elizabeth turns down Mr. Collins, she says, "You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so." So here we really see Elizabeth connecting the fact that she doesn't like Mr. Collins with him not being able to make her happy. Elizabeth really does buy into this Regency concept of romance built on mutual affection and respect and compatibility. Meanwhile, let's look at Charlotte, who rejects all of that, because she does not like Mr. Collins either. She calls him stupid. She calls his society irksome. She wants to get away from him as soon as possible. Jane Austen leaves us in absolutely zero doubt that Charlotte does not care for Mr. Collins' company. There's no like, Charlotte secretly thinks he's hot. Like, no, she does not like Mr. Collins. But she still marries him because he offers what she seeks for happiness, which is worldly advantage, as Elizabeth calls it. Basically, money, stability, and social standing. In fact, she tells Elizabeth, "I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connection, and situation in life, I'm convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." So it's really interesting that we have her identify what she wants: a comfortable home. Now, the way she evaluates Mr. Collins is whether or not he can provide that for her. His character, so far, he's not like a crazy gambler that's going to lose it all. His connections is to the Bennets, who he's going to inherit from, and his situation in life is even right now pretty good. I mean, he has a nice, comfortable parsonage there at Rosings for her to go live in. She is pinning all of her happiness on what he brings to the marriage financially. And so really for Charlotte, she is looking at a future of being either dependent on her brothers or marrying this guy who has all of these great provisions for her. And that's something we see also in Pride and Prejudice when she thinks about this. Without thinking highly either of men or matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. So here we see Charlotte looking at what is the pleasantest preservative from want. Because while she says it's the only provision, it really wasn't. She could have lived off the charity of her brothers. She could have become a governess. Those are the same options that Elizabeth was hypothetically choosing over Collins. Now, how pleasant are those options? They aren't. They are not pleasant options for a young lady. But Elizabeth, because she's so attached to this idea of romantic love and it being a source of happiness, and being in a marriage of not romantic love being a source of unhappiness, that she's willing to endure those hardships. Jane Austen herself was in a similar situation, like I talk about in my video on Jane Austen's love life. She had a chance to marry very well, and she turned it down. And later she told her niece that anything is preferable or endurable than marrying without affection. Jane Austen lived out the real life of what she has Elizabeth do in Pride and Prejudice when turning down Mr. Collins. And I think that's so interesting is she's not asking something from her characters that she was not willing to live herself. Meanwhile, we have Charlotte who doesn't believe in love, and she's not willing to endure those hardships for this concept. She'd rather be married to Mr. Collins and have the pleasantest, comfortable home possible. So I think all of this takes us back to the question of, did Charlotte Lucas make the right choice? And I feel like that is really left up to us as readers. Jane Austen leaves Elizabeth feeling like she's the happiest creature on the planet, and Charlotte pretty content with her lot there at Hunsford. Of course, how those marriages will ultimately turn out is going to be a test of time that we don't really get in Pride and Prejudice. But I think the most important thing to remember about Charlotte and Elizabeth is the fact that it's far more than Charlotte just being this old maid who kind of wants a husband and marries the irritating cousin. She serves as an ideological foil to Elizabeth's views on romance, human nature, and the true source of happiness. And I think Jane Austen was trying to engage in a greater debate on those issues with their two characters. Hey, let me know in the comments down below if you think Charlotte made the right choice or not. Do you think she's right? Is love even real? Can you know someone else truly, or at least enough to know that you'll be happy with them for a lifetime? These are the deep questions that Charlotte Lucas raises. Anyway, that has been today's video, and I hope you have enjoyed it and have gently pressed the like button at some point, which could be now. And I hope you guys keep having an awesome and amazing day, because you're awesome. Bye!